Okay, here's my summary of Comcast Corporation's uh, financial statements, basically just focusing on the revenue. And so here's a little summary of Comcast business operations. They currently report two um, business segments: connectivity and platforms, and then content and experiences. And then from a trending schedule, they post up on their investor relations. I've been able to break out U.S. cable operations in the connectivity and platforms segment, and then also the European Sky operations. And then on the content and experiences, I can break out media and studios, theme parks, and then Peacock. And so, the first thing I'm going to focus on here is just the consolidated revenue for Comcast. And here it is. So I focused on 2012 all the way up through 2024. And then I looked at the first quarter of 2024 and then compared it to what's happening in the first quarter of 2025. And a couple things to note here is that this big bump in revenue going from 17 to 18 is that Comcast paid a whopping $39 billion for the European Sky operations. And then we also have COVID hits in 2020, so we see this dip here. So if we look at from 2012, a little bit of history here going back all the way up to pre-COVID, it grew revenue at a compounded average annual growth rate of about 8% from 63 billion up to 109 billion. Not too shabby, very respectable. And then in COVID, it dips a bit, 5% decline overall for the whole organization. And then following COVID, it grows at a somewhat less pre-COVID rate of 1.2% from 104 billion up to 124 billion. And then looking at the first quarter of 2024 compared to the most recent first quarter of 2025, we've got no growth there. So we've gone from this period of time pre-COVID growing at 8%, a bit of a decline during COVID, some anemic growth post-COVID, and then in this last quarter compared to the prior quarter, we've really slowed down to no growth. So we just looked at Comcast, and now we're going to dig into the first of their two reportable segments in their 10K, connectivity and platforms. And we'll look at the connectivity and platforms, and here again, you see the bump from Sky here. And the result of that is revenue overall for the segment goes from 40 billion to 77 billion at a compounded average annual growth rate of 10%. And then during COVID, the connectivity and platforms, they don't experience any decline, but it growth slows from 10 to 2% in that year. And then post-COVID, again, an anemic 1%. So you've gone from 10% pre-COVID to 1% post-COVID. And then in the last two year-over-year quarters from 2025 first quarter, again, no growth. So growth has really slowed for Comcast. So let's dig in here then below the connectivity and platforms down to the U.S. cable operations. And unfortunately, I didn't have any of the U.S. I couldn't dig up the U.S. cable operation data post 2022 or post 2021. But in the period that I do have data, it shows pre-COVID they were growing revenue nice and steady from 40 billion to 58 billion at 6% compounded average annual growth, and then no drop through COVID, 5% gain there. And I suspect they are able to continue that through growing subscribers and pushing up their rate per subscriber or customer. And they may have continued that. And in another presentation, I'll dig into that a bit and look at their customer base and as a percentage of the overall market and the rates they're able to charge. And then again, I don't have any data here, but it looks like they're able to maintain their growth, and they're likely able to probably continue that up through 2024. Then we're going to look at the European Sky operations. Same issue. I have no data here. They acquire Sky here. Revenue in their first in 2018, revenue is 20 billion, and in 2021 it's also 20 billion. So no growth there. So likely they probably continued at no growth or declining growth. But I don't have the data to look at it, but they're not showing any growth, unlike the U.S. operations, where they were able to continue their growth rate somewhat close to what they had prior to COVID. And so Sky is likely dragging down the entire organization between 2022 and 2025. All right, so let's move over to their second segment, content and experiences, and see what that shows. So overall for the whole group, you can see here it grew at a nice 5% clip from 24 billion to 34 billion up just prior to COVID, and then during COVID they had a big drop. The theme parks and the studios had a big drop, 20%, but then post-COVID they exceed their pre-COVID growth rate of 13% from 27 billion to 45 billion. But unfortunately here in this last year-over-year quarter in 2025 first quarter, there's no growth there. So they're slowing down substantially from their post-COVID growth rate there. So now we're going to dig in below the segment into one of the three business units below and look at media and studios. And again, pre-COVID, media and studios grew at a nice clip of 4%. They had a little bit of a drop, 10% decline during 2020. And then post-COVID, they're growing at a higher rate than their pre-COVID. But again, unfortunately, in this last quarter, year over year, there's no growth. So they're slowing down here. They were higher post-COVID than they were pre-COVID, but in this last quarter, they're experiencing a slowdown. Now we'll move on to theme parks, the second business unit below content and experiences. And this is pretty impressive. So theme parks grew at a clip of average annual growth rate of 16% from 2.1 billion in 2012 up to 5.9 billion in 2019. They then, as you would expect when they closed the parks down, had a huge drop, 64% decline in revenue. And then post-COVID, really shot up at 42%, going pre-COVID their last year, 5.9 billion to 2024 to 8.6 billion. Really impressive. So post-COVID growth, much greater than pre-COVID growth. But unfortunately, there's a bit of a decline here in the most recent year-over-year quarter. So going from the first quarter of 2024 to the first quarter of 2025, a bit of a decline of about 5%. So it's, again, slowing down following some pretty substantial growth post-COVID. And then the last bucket here is a real bright spot in terms of revenue, is Peacock. So Peacock was launched in July of 2020, and the first year we have data is 2021. You can see it was growing compounded average annual growth rate of 85% from just under $1 billion to almost $5 billion. And then that growth rate still increasing, but growing at a much slower rate from 1.1 to 1.2 billion in the year-over-year quarters. So what's our conclusion here? Comcast U.S. cable operations are likely experiencing slow but steady growth, as evidenced by the charts, through customer growth and rate increases. Sky looks like it's weighing down overall operating results for the entire entity. And theme parks and Peacock remain key growth drivers that have slowed down over the past year, but could continue as a bright spot for the company going into the future. Okay, and so some upcoming analysis here. Part one I just finished was looking at the revenue for the entire consolidated organization and its two segments and business operating units below that. Part two, in the future, I'll look at profitability and cash flow of each of those business units and segments. Part three, I'm going to look at basically the cable operations and connectivity and platforms, their number of their customer relationships relative to their market, and then the revenue per relationship. And then finally, I'm going to do some comparison to revenue and profitability of their competitors, including Disney, Warner, and Paramount. So stay tuned.